Right now, sitting in your pantry is a supersaturated, highly acidic chemical cocktail.
Mm.
And it's so resilient that we've literally pulled perfectly edible jars of it out of 3,000-year-old Egyptian tombs.
Yeah.
But, and here's the crazy part, you can completely destroy its most potent medical benefits just by, dropping a spoonful of it into a normal cup of hot tea.
Yeah, it really is a profound biological paradox, honestly. I mean, you're talking about a substance that contains over 300 individual chemical components.
Over 300.
Oh, easily. Over 300. And it's forged through this biological process that humanity has been harvesting for, well, over 5.5 millennia. It's not just a sweetener, it's living chemistry.
Right. And because it's been around for thousands of years, it has collected just like thousands of years of folklore, old wives' tales, and frankly, outright misinformation. So welcome back to another deep dive. Today, our mission is to take a massive stack of sources. We're talking clinical trial data, reference guides from the National Honey Board, Food Standards Agency reports, and modern beekeeping manuals.
A really massive stack.
Yeah, huge. And we're going to separate the sticky facts from the sweet fiction. We're focusing on 10 specific, incredibly common misconceptions about nature's oldest sweetener.
Exactly, because we need to move past that really basic, sugar is sweet understanding. We are going to look at everyday kitchen handling, complex culinary chemistry, the botany, and finally, the actual metabolic and medical realities of honey.
Right, the stuff that actually happens in your body.
Yeah, because once you understand the underlying mechanisms, like the actual biology of what the bees are doing and how those specific compounds interact with human cells, you realize that almost everything we conventionally assume about honey is either, well, highly incomplete or just completely backwards.
You might think you know exactly what is inside that little plastic bear in your cupboard, but by the end of this deep dive, you're going to see it as a volatile, highly active substance. So let's start right where that plastic bear lives, in the kitchen.
The kitchen is where most of the damage happens, honestly.
Totally. I want to tackle a piece of advice I have heard from my grandmother, from food blogs, from basically everywhere. The rule is you should never, ever use a metal spoon to scoop your honey because the metal will instantly destroy the nutrients. I always pictured honey as secretly being some sort of werewolf that just reacts violently to silver. Like the second the metal touches it, the enzymes just hiss and vaporize.
I love that. It's a wonderfully cinematic image, but chemically, it is completely baseless.
Really? Completely.
Completely. This is an incredibly common misconception that is explicitly debunked across nutritional sources and food standard guidelines we reviewed. Using a standard metal spoon to scoop honey out of a jar will not obliterate its enzymes. It won't destroy its antioxidant profile, and it certainly won't, turn it into a toxic substance.
Okay, but where does a myth with that much staying power even originate? Because usually these things have at least a tiny kernel of scientific truth that just got distorted over time.
You're right, there is a kernel of truth here, and it's based on a misunderstanding of the pH scale and prolonged chemical reactions. So, honey is acidic.
Wait, acidic?
Yes.
I never think of honey as an acid. It just tastes like pure sugar.
Well, that's the biological trick of it. The intense sweetness of the fructose and glucose completely overpowers your tongue's sour taste receptors. You don't register the acidity, but chemically, honey has an average pH of around 3.9.
Wow, 3.9.
Yeah, which puts it roughly in the exact same acidity bracket as tomato juice, or even certain types of citrus juice.
Oh, wow.
And as a general rule of chemistry, acids do react with certain metals. This process is called galvanic corrosion.
Ah, okay. So if I leave an acidic substance in contact with metal, it eats away at it.
Precisely. If you were, say, an industrial food processor and you decided to store your honey long-term in a reactive, unlined metal container, like an old galvanized tin bucket or a raw copper vat over a period of weeks or months, that constant acidic exposure would cause corrosion.
Right, the acid would eat the metal.
Yeah, the metal ions would slowly leach into the honey. Now, it wouldn't necessarily destroy the nutritional profile entirely, but it would severely alter the taste. It gives it a harsh, metallic, really astringent flavor. Nobody wants to eat that.
So it's a matter of duration and the type of metal. A brief interaction, like, dipping a spoon in for 5 seconds to grab a scoop from my morning oatmeal, that doesn't provide nearly enough time for an acidic reaction to occur.
Not even close. Plus, we have to look at the material science of your kitchen. Your everyday silverware is almost certainly stainless steel.
Yeah, definitely.
And stainless steel contains chromium. That chromium forms a passive layer of chromium oxide right on the surface, making it highly resistant to acidic corrosion anyway. So a quick scoop with a modern spoon is completely harmless. The delicate enzymes and the nutritional value remain perfectly intact.
Okay, good to know my silverware drawer isn't a threat. But staying right there in the pantry, there is another physical change that happens to honey that constantly tricks people into throwing it away.
Oh, the crystallization.
Yes, I'm talking about when you pull a jar from the back of the shelf and instead of a nice golden liquid, it is turned into a cloudy, crunchy, solid rock. The immediate instinct is, well, this has gone bad, I had to toss it.
And as a result, a tragic amount of perfectly good, high-quality honey is thrown into the garbage every single day. Crystallization is not a sign of spoilage, it's not mold, it's not decay.
So what is it?
It is a completely natural physical process. In fact, if your honey crystallizes, it's generally a fantastic indicator of authenticity. To understand why, we have to look at the thermodynamics of supersaturation.
Supersaturation. So that means there's more stuff dissolved in the liquid than the liquid should theoretically be able to hold, right?
Exactly correct. Honey is essentially a supersaturated sugar solution. It's composed of roughly 82% carbohydrates, primarily the simple monosaccharides, fructose and glucose, and only about 17% water.
That's barely any water at all.
Right. And in the physical world, at room temperature, that specific ratio of solid solute to liquid solvent is inherently unstable. The sugar molecules desperately want to separate from the water and return to their lower energy solid crystalline state.
So it's less like food rotting and more like, okay, imagine those glucose molecules are people at a really crowded, chaotic, high-energy party in a tiny room.
Okay, I like this.
Yeah, eventually they get tired of bumping into each other in this tiny space. So they start grouping together, grabbing hands, and just sitting down on the floor to rest. The sitting down is a crystal forming.
That is a perfect analogy. The glucose molecules are precipitating out of the solution. But what is crucial to understand, and what dictates whether your honey turns into a rock in a month or stays liquid for a decade, is the exact ratio of the attendees at that party, specifically the ratio of glucose to fructose.
Wait, do glucose and fructose behave differently in water? I mean, they're both just sugars.
Oh, they behave radically differently. Fructose is highly soluble in water. It is very happy to just stay suspended in the liquid and mingle at the party. Glucose is significantly less soluble. It is the glucose that wants to precipitate out and form those solid crystals.
Okay.
Therefore, the speed of crystallization depends entirely on the botanical origin of the honey, like what specific flowers the bees were visiting.
Give me an example of how the flower actually changes that chemistry.
Let's look at clover honey, which is, ubiquitous in North American grocery stores.
Yeah.
Clover nectar naturally produces a really high proportion of glucose. That results in a glucose to fructose ratio of about 1.1 to 1.
So more glucose than fructose.
Yes. And because of that heavy glucose load, clover honey can crystallize into a solid block in just 2 to 4 weeks sitting in a cool pantry.
That fast. Just a couple of weeks.
Yeah, very fast. But if you look at acacia honey, which comes from the nectar of the black locust tree, the chemical profile is completely flipped. It has a much lower ratio, about 0.7 to 1. It is dominated by fructose, which, remember, dissolves effortlessly.
Right.
So acacia honey can stay perfectly liquid and clear for years. And then you have Tupelo honey, famously harvested in the swamps of the southeastern United States, which has such an incredibly low glucose ratio that it might sit on a shelf and not crystallize for decades.
That is fascinating. So the crunchiness isn't spoilage at all. It's literally a botanical fingerprint. It's the physical manifestation of the exact flower the bee visited.
Exactly.
But practically speaking, if I have a jar of clover honey that has turned into a solid block, how do I get the party back up and mingling? How do I rescue it?
You have to apply gentle, sustained heat. Heat increases the kinetic energy of the water molecules, which expands the space between them and increases their solubility capacity. That allows the glucose to dissolve right back into the liquid state.
So what's the method?
The scientifically correct way to rescue crystallized honey is a gentle water bath. You place the glass jar in a pot of warm water, ideally maintained between 35 and 45 degrees Celsius, for about 30 to 60 minutes.
Okay, 35 to 45 degrees Celsius. That's roughly 95 to 113 Fahrenheit. Basically just a warm bath.
Yes, a warm bath.
But let's be honest about human nature here. My immediate instinct when I see a solid block of honey in a plastic bear is to just, pop it into the microwave for 30 seconds and blast it back to a liquid.
Oh, please don't do that. That is the absolute worst thing you can do to honey. You must step away from the microwave.
I mean, it's just heat, isn't it? If the goal is just to warm it up, why does the source of the heat matter?
It matters massively because of dielectric heating. Microwaves do not heat substances evenly. They work by emitting electromagnetic waves that agitate water molecules, which causes friction and heat.
Right, standard microwave stuff.
But because honey is so thick and viscous, it doesn't convect. It doesn't swirl around and mix its own heat like a bowl of soup or water would. This creates localized, intense hot spots inside the honey.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, while one part of the jar might still be solid, a tiny pocket of honey an inch away could easily spike well over 100 degrees Celsius in a matter of seconds.
And I'm guessing 100 degrees Celsius is a death sentence for those 300 chemical compounds we talked about earlier.
It is absolute annihilation. Honey contains incredibly delicate thermolabile compounds. We're talking about things like beneficial enzymes, volatile aromatic oils, and complex antioxidants. We will dive deep into those specific enzymes shortly, but a microwave hotspot will permanently denature those proteins.
Wow.
You will melt the crystals, yes, but you will be left with a biologically dead syrup.
Okay, so temperature fixes the physical clumping of the glucose, but you have to do it gently. But heat isn't the only environmental factor trying to alter the honey in your pantry. The real enemy of that immortal tomb honey concept isn't temperature, it is moisture.
Moisture is the real threat.
Which brings us to those famous headlines we've all seen, right? Archaeologists find 3,000-year-old honey in an Egyptian tomb, and they tasted it, and it's perfectly fine.
And those archaeological discoveries are completely real. They highlight the miraculous stability of honey under very specific conditions. But the myth that grows out of those headlines, the idea that honey simply cannot spoil in your modern kitchen regardless of how you treat it, is just flat out false.
Because our kitchens aren't tombs.
Exactly. The immortality of honey depends entirely on the strict control of its internal moisture.
So how does moisture break the magic spell? Like if I leave the lid off my honey jar in a humid kitchen during the summer, what is actually happening at a chemical level?
Well, honey is highly hygroscopic. Because it is a supersaturated solution with such low water content, it has an immense osmotic pressure deficit. It desperately wants to pull water out of the surrounding environment to balance itself.
Oh, so it's thirsty.
Very thirsty. If you leave a jar unsealed on a humid day, the surface of that honey is actively sucking water vapor right out of the air like a sponge. And here is the critical biological threshold that the beekeeping manuals and food safety reports emphasize over and over, 18.6%.
18.6% water content. What happens when the honey crosses that specific line?
It triggers an awakening. Raw honey naturally contains dormant spores of osmophilic yeast. These yeasts are omnipresent in the environment, and bees naturally bring them right into the hive.
So the yeast is always there.
Always there. But when the moisture is low below that 18.6% mark, the high sugar concentration of the honey literally sucks the water out of the yeast cells through osmosis. It keeps them in a state of suspended animation. They are technically alive, but they cannot function.
But once the honey absorbs enough water from the humid air, the osmotic pressure drops, and the yeast cells can finally hydrate.
Exactly. The yeast hydrates, wakes up, and realizes it is swimming in an infinite ocean of food. Once the water content creeps up toward 20%, active fermentation begins. The yeast aggressively consumes the glucose and fructose and metabolizes them.
And what do they turn the sugar into?
The byproducts of this metabolic process are ethanol, which is alcohol and carbon dioxide gas.
So your honey is essentially brewing itself into mead right there on the shelf.
Pretty much.
If someone's immortal food has officially spoiled and started fermenting, what are the physical signs? Like, how would they know?
The carbon dioxide is the most obvious indicator. You will begin to see tiny bubbles forming, often trapped within the structure if the honey is partially crystallized. The surface of the honey might begin to foam or look frothy.
Bubbles are bad. Got it.
And if you open the jar, instead of that sweet floral aroma, it will emit a distinct sour, bread-like, or even distinctly alcoholic odor.
Does the temperature of the kitchen play a role in this, or is it purely about the water content?
Temperature acts as a massive accelerator. If the honey hits that 20% moisture threshold and it is stored in a warm room, generally anything above 25 degrees Celsius, the metabolic rate of the yeast skyrockets.
So it ferments way faster.
Much, much faster. This is exactly why the honey in the Egyptian tombs survived. The tunes were sealed, profoundly dry desert environments. The honey never had the chance to absorb ambient moisture, so the dormant yeast just remained dormant for 3 millennia.
It's all about keeping it sealed and dry. Okay, so we've established that ambient moisture and room temperature can fundamentally change honey's chemical structure. But what happens when we intentionally apply severe heat to it in our daily cooking routines? Because that transitions us from accidental pantry mistakes to deliberate culinary choices, and specifically how we spend our money at the grocery store.
This is perhaps the most economically impactful area of consumer misunderstanding we're going to cover. It directly dictates whether you are actually getting the health benefits you're paying for or if you are simply burning your money.
Let's look at the premium market. People pay a massive markup, sometimes 20 to 50% more per ounce, for jars explicitly labeled raw, unfiltered honey. And the overarching myth is that raw honey is inherently and immutably healthier, even when you stir it into boiling water for tea or use it as a substitute for sugar in baking.
Right. And the foundational premise of that is correct. Raw honey does contain unique, potent health benefits. It contains a full spectrum of active enzymes, volatile organic compounds, and a really high antioxidant capacity.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch. The critical failure in consumer logic is ignoring the fact that these beneficial compounds are, as we briefly mentioned with the microwave, highly thermolabile. They are biologically active proteins, and proteins are exquisitely sensitive to thermal degradation.
I really want to dig into the actual clinical numbers here, because you mentioned enzymes earlier. What specific enzymes are we talking about, and exactly how fragile are they?
Okay, let's focus on two vital enzymes present in raw honey: diastase and invertase. Diastase helps break down complex starches into simpler sugars, and invertase is the enzyme the bees use to break down the sucrose in flower nectar into the fructose and glucose that makes up honey.
Okay, so the bees put those in there.
Yes. Now, inside a living beehive, the bees work very hard to maintain a constant warm temperature of roughly 40 degrees Celsius.
40 Celsius, that's about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, like a hot summer day.
Right. And at that natural hive temperature of 40 degrees Celsius, those enzymes are incredibly stable. It takes about 31 days for the invertase enzyme to naturally break down and lose its biological activity.
Okay, so it lasts a month at 40 degrees. But what happens when I feel a sore throat coming on? I boil the kettle, pour a mug of hot water, and drop a heavy spoonful of that expensive raw honey right into my tea.
Well, a freshly poured cup of hot tea is roughly 80 degrees Celsius.
Huh.
Let's look at the degradation curve for that. At 80 degrees Celsius, that same invertase enzyme doesn't take 31 days to break down. It takes exactly 8.6 minutes.
8.6 minutes. So literally, by the time the ceramic mug is cool enough for me to comfortably drink it, I have effectively boiled away the primary enzymatic health benefits of the raw honey.
Completely. The thermal energy breaks the weak hydrogen bonds that hold the complex three-dimensional structure of the enzyme together. The protein unfolds, a process called denaturation, and once it unfolds, its active sites are destroyed. It can never, ever function again.
And if we look at baking?
Oh, baking is instantaneous destruction.
Right, because an oven is way hotter than a cup of tea.
Exactly. If you use raw honey in a muffin recipe and put it into an oven at 150 to 180 degrees Celsius, you are instantly annihilating every bioactive compound, every enzyme, and significantly degrading the complex antioxidants.
So there is a massive ironic disconnect here in consumer behavior. People are paying top dollar for raw, unpasteurized, living honey specifically for its health benefits, and then taking it home and instantly pasteurizing it themselves right on their own stove.
It is a profound waste of resources.
Yeah.
Once you subject raw honey to that level of thermal stress, chemically and nutritionally, it becomes virtually indistinguishable from the cheap, heavily processed, pasteurized commercial honey sitting in the plastic bear for a fraction of the price.
The takeaway here is incredibly practical then. Compartmentalize your honey usage. Save your expensive raw local honey for strictly room temperature applications. Drizzle it on Greek yogurt, spread it on toast, mix it into a cold salad dressing, or, just eat it right off the spoon.
Yes.
But if you are baking cookies or making a hot toddy, save your wallet and just use the cheap processed stuff. It all ends up as the same simple sugars once it hits the heat anyway.
That is the most scientifically and economically sound culinary advice you can possibly follow.
Well, speaking of that cheap stuff, let's look at how commercial honey is actually processed, because there is a massive controversy around filtering. You see these viral videos online of people holding up a perfectly clear golden jar of supermarket honey and claiming, if your honey is clear, it's fake. It's just high fructose corn syrup and you've been scammed. The myth is that filtered honey is inherently fake honey.
This is a really significant oversimplification of a very complex industrial reality. To be absolutely clear here, the physical act of filtering honey does not inherently make it fake. Commercial filtered honey is still fundamentally honey.
Okay, so it's real.
It is. It is simply honey that has undergone an intense industrial process. It is first heated, usually flash pasteurized at around 70 to 78 degrees Celsius to lower its viscosity, and then it is forced under immense pressure through microscopic filtration membranes.
How microscopic are we talking here? Like, what are they actively trying to physically remove from the liquid?
These industrial filters have pores as small as 0.1 to zero point 0.5 microns. They are incredibly fine, and their primary target is the complete removal of pollen grains. Pollen grains are comparatively massive, usually ranging between 15 and 100 microns in size.
But wait, why would a company spend millions of dollars on specialized filtration equipment to actively strip a natural biological component out of their own product? Doesn't pollen have trace nutrients?
It does, but we have to look back at the physical chemistry we discussed earlier with the crystallization. Remember how we said glucose molecules need to group together to form a solid crystal?
The people sitting down at the party.
Yes, exactly. In fluid dynamics, crystals need a nucleation point, a seed, to grab onto to actually start the process. Suspended pollen grains act as the perfect nucleation seeds for sugar crystals.
Ah, so the pollen is the very first person to sit down at the crowded party and everyone else just clumps around them.
That is exactly it. And large multinational supermarket chains despise crystallization. They demand strict uniformity. They want honey that will stay perfectly clear, golden, and liquid under harsh fluorescent lights for 12 to 18 months.
Because consumers are picky.
Right, because, as we established, the average consumer sees cloudy, crystallized honey and incorrectly assumes it has gone bad. It's a self-perpetuating cycle of consumer ignorance driving intense industrial processing.
So commercial packers use ultrafiltration to remove the pollen seeds, ensuring a long, visually appealing shelf life. The substance left over is still composed of bee-processed nectar sugars. It's heavily processed, but it's not fake in the sense of being synthetic. However, this introduces a fascinating and, frankly, incredibly dark side to the global honey industry. Because pollen isn't just a seed for crystals, it's a barcode.
This is where the science of filtration intersects with actual international crime. When you strip away the pollen, you don't just remove the crystallization seeds, you completely obliterate the geographic and botanical fingerprint of the honey.
Explain how pollen acts as a fingerprint. How precise is this science?
It relies on a scientific discipline called palynology, the microscopic study of pollen and spores. When bees forage, they inevitably collect stray pollen grains along with the nectar, which end up suspended in the honey. Because every single plant species produces a structurally unique pollen grain, palynologists can put a sample of raw honey under an electron microscope, identify the specific mix of pollen, and tell you exactly what flowers the bees visited.
And because specific flowers only grow in specific regions.
Exactly. By identifying the pollen profile, they can pinpoint not just the country of origin, but often the specific province or microregion where that honey was harvested.
Okay, so let's say I'm a bad actor in the international supply chain. Let's say I'm sitting on tons of cheap, low-quality honey that is contaminated with illegal antibiotics, or I'm operating in a country that is facing massive, punitive import tariffs from the United States. Pollen is my absolute worst enemy. Because the moment the FDA looks at my honey under a microscope, they know exactly where it came from.
Precisely. And this is exactly why ultrafiltration is the weapon of choice for fraudsters. The FDA has uncovered massive, highly coordinated honey laundering syndicates. In one of the most famous cases, a network was busted for illegally transshipping over $40 million worth of honey.
$40 million. How did the logistics of a scheme like that actually work?
It's incredibly elaborate. The syndicates would take honey produced in countries facing heavy anti-dumping tariffs. They would physically ship it to a neutral third country. There, they would set up industrial facilities to heat and ultrafilter the honey, completely stripping out every single grain of identifying pollen. Yeah, Often they would then blend it with cheap rice syrup or corn syrup to stretch the volume even further. Then they would forge the shipping manifests, claiming the honey actually originated in that neutral third country, and import it into the United States tax-free.
That is wild. It's literally the equivalent of an international car theft ring grinding the VIN numbers off a stolen vehicle so customs can't track it.
It is the exact same principle. Without the pollen, border officials historically had an incredibly difficult time proving the true origin of the shipment. Furthermore, filtering hides the heavy metals and illegal veterinary drugs that might be bound to the particulates.
So it hides everything.
Right. So while your original statement is correct, filtered honey isn't necessarily fake. The filtering process itself provides the ultimate cloak of invisibility for massive multinational agricultural fraud.
So filtering strips away the pollen, which tells us the where of the honey. But what about the nectar, which dictates the what? We touched on clover versus acacia earlier when talking about crystallization, but does the type of flower a bee visits actually change the nutritional and chemical makeup of the honey?
Oh, absolutely.
Because that perfectly sets up our next botanical myth. Light honey and dark honey are nutritionally identical.
I think a lot of people operate under the assumption that honey is just a monolith. They view it purely as a sweetener, a simple delivery mechanism for sugar, regardless of what it looks like. That assumption is biologically and chemically false. Not all honeys are created equal, and color is a massive visible indicator of chemical composition.
So if I'm looking at a grocery store shelf and I see a jar of pale, almost translucent clover honey sitting right next to a jar of thick, dark buckwheat honey, what is the actual measurable difference beneath the surface?
The most profound difference lies in the concentration of phenolic compounds and flavonoids. These are complex phytochemicals that the plants produce, which are then concentrated in the nectar and subsequently in the honey.
And what do?
They act as incredibly powerful antioxidants in the human body, neutralizing free radicals and protecting your cells from oxidative stress.
And the darker honeys have more of these compounds.
Significantly more. We were talking about honeys derived from plants like buckwheat, chestnut, heather, or certain deep forest honeydews. These plants produce a thick, robust, almost molasses-like honey. Scientific studies comparing these varieties reveal a staggering difference in antioxidant capacity.
How staggering.
The dark honeys consistently demonstrate a 2 to 4 times higher antioxidant activity level than the light varieties.
2 to 4 times. That's not a marginal difference.
It is a massive nutritional gulf. Light honeys, like clover or orange blossom, are beautiful culinary ingredients. They are pale, they have a delicate floral aroma, and they have a very mild, universally appealing sweet flavor. But nutritionally, they are relatively sparse compared to their dark counterparts.
It sounds incredibly similar to the rules we follow for vegetables. Light honey is essentially the iceberg lettuce of the sweetener world.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Yeah, iceberg lettuce is sweet, it's crunchy, it provides great texture on a burger, but nutritionally it's basically just crunchy water.
Yeah.
Dark honey, on the other hand, is like dark leafy greens like spinach or kale or Swiss chard. It's absolutely packed with phytochemicals and antioxidants. But the trade-off is that it comes with a much stronger, robust, earthy, sometimes slightly bitter flavor profile that takes a bit of getting used to.
That is an exceptionally accurate biological parallel. You're trading a bit of straightforward, mild sweetness for a massive boost in medicinal compounds. The darker the plant pigment, generally, the higher the flavonoid count.
That makes total sense.
So, if a consumer is choosing to incorporate honey into their diet, specifically for its health benefits, say, trying to increase their antioxidant intake to lower systemic inflammation, they shouldn't just grab whatever is cheapest or palest. They should actively be hunting for the darkest, most opaque honey they can find.
That is a great tip.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to a myth that is so deeply ingrained in our culture, it feels almost like heresy to question it. Every single spring, without fail, as soon as the pollen counts go up and my eyes start watering, someone tells me, you need to buy local raw honey. It will cure your seasonal allergies.
I hear it constantly.
It's the ultimate homeopathic logic.
Yeah.
Consume the problem to cure the problem.
It is an incredibly elegant and appealing idea, and it operates on the very real medical logic of immunotherapy, which is the foundational concept of vaccines or allergy shots.
Right, expose yourself to a little bit to build immunity.
Exactly. The theory suggests that by consuming small, regular doses of local pollen trapped in raw honey, you will gradually desensitize your immune system to the allergens in your environment. But when you subject this theory to rigorous clinical trials and then cross-reference it with basic botanical science, the entire concept disintegrates.
It disintegrates completely. Let's look at the clinical data first. Has this actually been tested in a controlled environment?
Yes, extensively. A major, highly cited randomized controlled trial published in 2002 tackled this exact question head-on. The researchers gathered a large group of seasonal allergy sufferers and divided them into 3 distinct cohorts.
Okay, who got what?
One group received a completely inactive placebo, basically just a honey-flavored synthetic syrup. The second group received standard, commercially processed, ultra-filtered honey that contains 0 pollen. And the third group received precisely what the folklore demands: unpasteurized, unfiltered, raw, local honey, packed full of local pollen.
That is a perfectly designed test.
So what happened to their symptoms?
I'm guessing the raw honey group saw at least a marginal improvement over the synthetic syrup.
There was absolutely 0 statistical difference between the 3 groups. None.
Wait, not at all.
None. The individuals consuming the raw, pollen-rich, local honey experienced the exact same severity of runny noses, itchy eyes, and sneezing as the people eating the completely fake, pollenless syrup. The local honey performed no better than a placebo.
Wow. Okay, if the logic of immunotherapy is sound, which it is for allergy shots, why did the honey fail so completely? You are literally eating the local pollen. Why isn't it training your immune system to ignore it?
To understand the failure, we have to stop looking at human immune systems and start looking at the evolutionary biology of plants, specifically how different plants choose to reproduce.
Okay, let's talk botany.
Bees are pollinators, but they do not pollinate everything. Bees collect what biologists call entomophilous pollen. The word literally translates to insect-pollinated.
What does insect-pollinated pollen look like compared to other pollen?
It is designed to be transported by a physical carrier. Therefore, the plants produce pollen grains that are lard, heavy, highly sticky, and highly nutritious. Furthermore, to attract the bees in the first place, these plants produce bright, colorful, fragrant flowers, and they offer a reward: sweet nectar.
Okay, so the bees are drawn to the flashy flowers, and they get covered in the heavy, sticky pollen.
Correct. However, seasonal allergies, the classic hay fever that makes you miserable in the spring and fall, are overwhelmingly triggered by a completely different class of plants. Allergies are caused by anemophilous pollen, which means wind-pollinated.
Wind-pollinated, like trees and grasses.
Exactly. Trees like oak and cedar, various grasses, and highly allergenic weeds like ragweed. These plants do not rely on insects for reproduction. They don't need to attract bees, so they don't waste biological energy producing bright flowers or sweet nectar.
They just use the wind.
Right. Their evolutionary strategy is brute force. They produce trillions of microscopic, incredibly lightweight, buoyant pollen grains, and they simply launch them into the wind, hoping they land on another plant.
And because there is no nectar in a ragweed plant, the bees have absolutely no reason to ever visit it.
Precisely. The bees ignore the wind-pollinated plants entirely. Therefore, the buoyant, microscopic pollen that is floating through the air, getting inhaled into your sinuses, and triggering your massive histamine response is simply not the pollen that the bees are collecting and bringing back to the hive.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, the pollen suspended in your local raw honey is from the sticky, colorful wildflowers, not the ragweed or the oak trees that are actually causing your immune system to panic.
That is a massive biological disconnect. It's like trying to get a vaccine for the flu by injecting yourself with a completely different, totally unrelated virus. It's the wrong target.
It is the wrong target entirely. And what's fascinating is that there is an even deeper layer of biochemical complexity that renders the immunotherapy theory completely moot.
There's more.
Oh, yes. Even in the highly unlikely event that a bee accidentally flew through a cloud of ragweed pollen and got some stuck to its body, it wouldn't matter.
Why not? The pollen is still in the hive, isn't it? If I eat the honey, I eat the ragweed pollen.
Because bees do not just dump raw pollen into the honey cells. They process their food. Pollen in its raw state is surrounded by an incredibly tough outer shell called the exene. To digest the proteins inside, the bees gather the pollen, mix it with their own specialized glandular secretions, saliva, and a bit of nectar, and pack it into cells to undergo a lactic acid fermentation process.
They ferment the pollen.
Yes. This creates a substance called bee bread.
And fermentation changes the chemical structure of things.
Exactly. The fermentation process actively breaks down the complex protein structures of the pollen to make the amino acids bioavailable for the growing larvae. And what triggers an allergic reaction in humans, It is our immune system misidentifying those specific intact protein structures.
So even if the ragweed pollen magically made it into the hive, the bee's own saliva and fermentation process would literally break down the specific allergenic proteins before you ever ate it.
Yes. The chemical structure of the allergen has been fundamentally altered. So not only is it the wrong pollen, but any accidental trace of the right pollen has been chemically neutralized by the bee's digestive processes. The science is overwhelming. Local honey will not cure your allergies. It supports local agriculture. It's delicious, but it is not antihistamine medication.
That is such a brilliant breakdown of the botany. So while honey might fail completely against airborne pollen, its actual verified medical properties are far more dramatic, especially when we pivot from allergies to actual infection. Let's look at how it fights pathogens, which brings us to the medical and antimicrobial science of honey.
This is a spectacular area of research. It's where ancient medicine is being totally validated by modern microbiology. Honey truly transcends being just a food here and steps into the realm of potent pharmacology.
The major myth here is about how that pharmacology works. Specifically, the belief that honey's antibacterial power is entirely due to hydrogen peroxide.
Right. And to be fair to the myth, we first need to acknowledge the reality of hydrogen peroxide in honey. It is true that the vast majority of standard honeys rely heavily on hydrogen peroxide for their antiseptic qualities.
How does peroxide even get in there?
It's a brilliant evolutionary defense mechanism. As bees collect nectar, they secrete an enzyme from their hypopharyngeal gland called glucose oxidase.
Glucose oxidase. What does that actually do to the nectar?
As the honey cures in the hive, this enzyme slowly oxidizes the glucose sugars, breaking them down to produce two things: gluconic acid, which lowers the pH, and hydrogen peroxide. It acts as a slow-release preservative, keeping bacteria and fungi from spoiling the honey while it's stored for the winter.
Okay, so if I get a cut of my finger and I put normal raw honey on it, what happens?
The moisture from your blood and tissue plasma dilutes the honey. This dilution triggers a sudden burst of activity from the dormant glucose oxidase enzyme. That results in a slow, sustained, low-level release of hydrogen peroxide directly into the wound bed, killing surface bacteria.
So it's like a natural continuous release version of that brown bottle of liquid hydrogen peroxide you buy at the pharmacy, but maybe gentler on the tissues.
Exactly. It's highly effective for minor abrasions. However, the myth is that this is the only antibacterial mechanism honey possesses. The reality is that the most medically potent, highly prized honeys in the world rely on entirely different non-peroxide mechanisms.
Okay, and the undisputed king of this category, dominating clinical research, is Manuka honey.
Yes, Manuka honey is incredible.
Everyone has seen this in high-end health food stores. It's usually locked in glass cabinets, and it sells for $50, sometimes $80 for a tiny little jar. What makes this specific honey so biochemically unique?
Manuka honey is produced exclusively by bees foraging on the nectar of the Leptospermum scoparium plant, which is a scrub bush native primarily to New Zealand and parts of Australia. Its immense, world-renowned antibacterial power does not rely on fragile hydrogen peroxide. It is driven by a staggeringly high concentration of a specific naturally occurring dicarbonyl compound called methylglyoxal, or MgO.
Methylglyoxal. Why is MgO so much better at killing bacteria than hydrogen peroxide?
It comes down to resilience. Hydrogen peroxide is incredibly fragile. It degrades rapidly when exposed to heat, when exposed to light, and most importantly, it is instantly neutralized by an enzyme called catalase.
Where is catalase found?
It is ubiquitous in human blood and cellular tissue.
Oh, no.
Yeah, when you put regular peroxide-based honey into a deep, bleeding wound, the body's own catalase enzymes rush in and rapidly break down the hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. It neutralizes the honey's antibacterial defense almost immediately.
Ah, so the human body accidentally disarms the standard honey. Does catalase disarm MgO too?
It does not. MgO is completely unaffected by human tissue enzymes. Furthermore, its thermal stability is remarkable. Studies have shown that Manuka's MgO retains its full, potent antibacterial properties even when heated to 95 degrees Celsius.
Wait, 95 degrees Celsius? We just spent 10 minutes talking about how dropping honey into 80-degree tea destroys all its enzymes. But the MgO in Manuka honey survives near boiling temperatures.
Yes. Because MgO is not a fragile protein enzyme, it is a stable organic compound. It blasts right through the body's enzymatic defenses, survives heat, and goes straight for the bacterial cells. But the true genius of honey's antibacterial pharmacology is that it doesn't just use one weapon.
It uses more.
It launches a coordinated, multi-vector attack against pathogens simultaneously.
Walk me through this coordinated attack. What is the full arsenal?
We have four primary vectors. First, you have the direct cellular toxicity of the MgO we just talked about. Second, you have the high osmolarity we discussed earlier, the supersaturation.
Right, the honey is so desperate for water it acts like a sponge.
Exactly. When honey physically touches a bacterial cell, the intense osmotic pressure literally sucks the intracellular fluid right out through the bacteria's cell wall. It causes the pathogen to shrivel and die of rapid, catastrophic dehydration.
That is a brutal mechanism, just dehydrating the bacteria to death.
But it is physical destruction, not just chemical. Third, you have the low pH, the acidity of 3.9. Most pathogenic bacteria that infect humans thrive in a neutral pH environment, usually around 7.2 to 7.4. Dropping them into a highly acidic environment severely inhibits their ability to reproduce and maintain their cellular integrity.
That makes 3 weapons.
And fourth, recent genomic research has discovered that bees secrete a specific, potent antimicrobial peptide into the honey called defensin-1. This peptide actively targets and destroys the structural integrity of bacterial cell membranes.
Okay, wait. Let's look at the bigger picture here. If honey is this devastatingly effective at killing bacteria, attacking it through direct chemical toxicity, catastrophic dehydration, acid burns, and targeted peptides all at the exact same time, why aren't doctors prescribing it? If I have a bad staph infection, why am I taking a pill that wrecks my gut flora instead of just using honey?
That is the beautiful part of modern medicine. They are prescribing it. Yes, but they are not using a jar of Manuka honey bought off a supermarket shelf. They use a highly specialized, federally regulated product called medical-grade honey.
How does medical-grade honey differ from the expensive jar of Manuka in my pantry?
Purity and sterility. Raw honey, as we will discuss shortly, contains dormant bacterial spores. You simply cannot put unsterilized agricultural products into an open surgical wound. So medical-grade honey is carefully microfiltered to remove all physical debris. Then, crucially, it is sterilized using gamma irradiation.
Gamma rays, like actual radiation.
Yes. Gamma rays penetrate the honey and completely obliterate any dormant bacterial spores, like botulism. But because gamma radiation doesn't generate heat, it perfectly preserves the delicate defensin-1 peptides, the MgO, and the glucose oxidase enzymes.
That is brilliant.
It is. This sterile, hyperpotent medical honey is actively used in modern clinical settings, burn wards, and trauma centers all over the world. It is a frontline treatment for severe third-degree burn wounds, for chronic diabetic foot ulcers that refuse to close, and most impressively, for treating MRSA.
MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, the terrifying superbugs that have evolved to survive our strongest pharmaceutical antibiotics. Honey can kill them.
It absolutely decimates them, and the reason why is profound. Pharmaceutical antibiotics generally target one specific, highly complex metabolic pathway within a bacteria. Because bacteria mutate so rapidly, they can eventually develop a genetic workaround to block that single pathway, creating antibiotic resistance.
But bacteria cannot mutate fast enough to survive honey.
Because honey isn't just attacking one pathway.
Right.
Exactly. Honey is attacking via extreme dehydration, severe acidity, peptide membrane disruption, and MgO toxicity all at the exact same time. It is a synchronized, overwhelming assault on the fundamental physical structure of the cell. Bacteria simply cannot genetically evolve resistance to having all their water physically sucked out of them. So against MRSA, medical honey succeeds where billion-dollar synthetic antibiotics fail.
That is genuinely staggering. So we can clearly see how honey completely dominates bacteria externally when applied to a wound. But what happens internally when we ingest it? This brings us to segment 5. The metabolic realities, and we have to tackle the biggest elephant in the room when talking about sweet foods: sugar.
This is a highly nuanced area of endocrinology and metabolism, and it requires us to strictly separate the biological effects of honey from the effects of highly refined isolated sucrose.
Which sets up our next myth perfectly. Because it is mostly sugar, honey is entirely forbidden, or at least highly dangerous, for diabetics to consume.
Right.
On the surface, this logic seems bulletproof. We established an hour ago that honey is roughly 82% carbohydrates, specifically glucose and fructose. If a patient's primary medical condition is an inability to process sugar, eating a spoonful of 82% pure sugar sounds like a catastrophic idea.
It does sound incredibly counterintuitive, and for decades, the standard medical advice was a blanket prohibition: no honey for diabetics. But as clinical endocrinology has advanced, the data reveals that the metabolic effects of honey are vastly more complex than refined white table sugar. It all comes down to the specific ratios of the sugars, how the liver processes them, and the vast array of phytochemicals packaged alongside them.
Let's start with the basics of how it hits the bloodstream. How does honey compare to normal sugar on the glycemic index?
The glycemic index, or GI, measures how rapidly a carbohydrate is broken down and spikes your blood glucose levels. Refined white table sugar, sucrose, has an average GI of around 68. Honey, depending on the floral source, has a significantly lower average GI of around 55.
Okay, 55 is lower than 68, but it's still raising your blood sugar. Why is it slower?
Primarily because of the fructose. Fructose and glucose are metabolized through completely different physiological pathways.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, glucose enters the bloodstream directly and requires an immediate spike in insulin to push it into the cells. Fructose, however, does not require insulin for its initial absorption. It is processed almost entirely by the liver. Because honey contains a high percentage of fructose, it blunts the immediate aggressive spike in blood sugar that you see with pure glucose or sucrose.
Okay, so it's a slower spike. But you mentioned clinical trials earlier. What happens when you actually give honey to diabetic patients in a controlled setting?
The clinical trials present a fascinating, complex reality that differs dramatically depending on the specific type of diabetes. Let's look closely at type 1 diabetics first.
Type 1 is the autoimmune condition where the body attacks its own pancreas, resulting in zero natural insulin production, right?
Correct. A very compelling study took type 1 diabetics and compared their metabolic response to pure sucrose versus honey. Unsurprisingly, the honey generated a significantly lower peak incremental index, meaning the overall spike in blood glucose was much flatter.
Which is good.
Yes, but that wasn't the incredible part. The researchers found that consuming the honey actually stimulated a measurable increase in the patient's C-peptide levels.
Wait, C-peptide. If type 1 diabetics don't produce insulin, what is a C-peptide and why is an increase significant? Is the fructose bypassing the pancreas entirely?
The fructose doesn't bypass the pancreas, no, but the measurement of C-peptide gives us a window into what the pancreas is struggling to do. Proinsulin is the precursor to insulin. When the pancreas cleaves proinsulin to create active insulin, it releases a byproduct called C-peptide.
Okay, so it's a byproduct of making insulin.
Yes, and because C-peptide stays in the bloodstream longer than insulin, endocrinologists use it as a highly accurate biomarker to measure the functional capacity of the pancreatic beta cells, the exact cells that are failing in type 1 diabetes.
So if C-peptide levels go up, it implies the pancreas is producing more insulin.
Exactly. An increase in C-peptide after consuming honey suggests that the honey was somehow stimulating, or perhaps even protecting, the residual beta cells in the pancreas. The current hypothesis is that the dense concentration of powerful antioxidants and anti-inflammatory flavonoids in the honey actively reduces oxidative stress within the pancreas, providing a protective, regenerative effect that empty refined sugar absolutely does not possess.
That is remarkable, a sugar that potentially protects the organ that processes sugar. But what about type 2 diabetes? Because that is vastly more common, and it's characterized by insulin resistance. The body makes insulin, but the cells just stop responding to it.
Right. And for type 2 diabetics, the clinical data provides a very clear, stark warning. The dose is the poison.
The dose is the poison.
Yes. A highly insightful long-term study out of Turkey followed a large cohort of patients with type 2 diabetes for 4 months. They found that prescribing a very moderate, controlled dose of honey between 5 and 25 grams daily actually reduced the patient's HbA1c levels.
HbA1c. That is the gold standard test that measures your average blood sugar over the last 3 months, right? It shows how much sugar is physically attached to your red blood cells.
Yes. A reduction in HbA1c is a major clinical victory. It means long-term, systemic control of blood sugar actually improved. The researchers theorized that the bioactive compounds in the honey, specifically those polyphenols we discussed, act to attenuate the glycemic response at a cellular level. Furthermore, the 5 to 25 gram dose improved the patient's overall lipid profiles. It significantly lowered triglycerides and LDL, the bad cholesterol, while raising HDL, the good cholesterol.
Okay, so 5 to 25 grams a day improved their long-term markers. What happens if they eat more than that?
This is the crucial caveat. In the exact same study, when the researchers increased the daily dose to 50 grams of honey, the protective effects vanished. The patient's HbA1c levels significantly increased.
Because it's too much sugar.
Precisely. The sheer metabolic burden of the concentrated carbohydrates completely overwhelmed the protective benefits of the antioxidants.
So if we synthesize all this data, what is the actual practical takeaway for a listener managing diabetes? It sounds like honey isn't forbidden, but it's not a miracle cure either.
The synthesis is this. Honey is not a free pass for diabetics. It is a concentrated source of carbohydrates and must be meticulously counted as added sugar in any dietary plan. However, if it is used strictly as an isocaloric replacement for refined sugar, for example, completely removing the 2 teaspoons of white sugar in your morning oatmeal and substituting it with 1 teaspoon of raw, dark honey, the science suggests its unique bioactive compounds may offer metabolic benefits. It might reduce systemic inflammation and lower cardiovascular risk factors that empty table sugar simply cannot provide.
The key word is replacement, not addition. You can't just eat your normal diet, add a huge spoonful of honey on top, and expect your blood sugar to go down.
Exactly. Moderation and substitution are the absolute rules.
That perfectly transitions us to our final topic. We've talked extensively about the incredible health benefits and the complex biochemistry of honey, which inevitably leads to a massive assumption that permeates the modern wellness industry. Myth 10. Because honey is 100% natural, unprocessed, and made by bees, it is inherently pure and always safe for everyone to consume straight from the source.
This is perhaps the most dangerous fallacy we will discuss today.
Dangerous.
Highly dangerous. It relies on the appeal to nature logical fallacy, the idea that natural equates to benign. Nature is not benign. Nature is an ongoing chemical arms race full of potent toxins, heavy metals, and microscopic biological threats. Honey, precisely because it is a raw, unsterilized, naturally gathered product, carries several distinct, severe risks based heavily on biology and the environment in which it was created.
Let's break down those severe risks, starting with one that is literally printed on the back of every commercially sold bottle of honey. Analysis 1. Infant botulism. The warning label explicitly states, do not feed to infants under 1 year of age. Why is a spoonful of honey incredibly dangerous for a 6-month-old baby, but perfectly 100% safe for me to eat right out of the jar?
It comes down to the microbiological development of the human digestive tract. As we touched on briefly when discussing medical-grade honey, raw honey, and even standard, pasteurized supermarket honey can contain dormant endospores of a bacteria called Clostridium botulinum.
Botulinum. That is the bacteria that produces botulism, which is a lethal neurotoxin. How do these spores get into the honey in the first place?
Clostridium botulinum spores are ubiquitous in nature. They exist in soil, in dust, on the surface of plants. As bees fly around foraging, the static electricity on their bodies attracts dust particles containing these spores, which they inevitably track back into the hive and mix into the honey.
Okay, so the spores are in the honey. If I eat a spoonful of raw honey, I am eating those spores. Why don't I get botulism?
Because you have a mature, highly developed digestive system. When a healthy adult or an older child ingests those dormant spores, they enter an incredibly hostile environment. Our stomach acid is fiercely acidic, and more importantly, our intestines are completely colonized by a massive, established army of competitive gut flora, billions of beneficial bacteria.
Right, our microbiome.
Yes, these established bacteria outcompete the botulinum spores for resources and physically prevent them from germinating. The spores just pass right through our system harmlessly.
We have an internal ecosystem that protects us. But an infant doesn't have that ecosystem yet.
Precisely. An infant under 12 months of age has a relatively immature digestive tract. Their gut flora is essentially a blank slate. It hasn't fully colonized yet. If an infant ingests honey containing those dormant spores, the spores enter the intestines and find absolutely no competition.
Oh, that's bad.
It is. They encounter a warm, nutrient-rich environment, so they germinate, multiply rapidly, and begin synthesizing the botulinum neurotoxin directly inside the baby's gut.
What does that neurotoxin physically do to the infant?
The toxin binds to the presynaptic nerve terminals. It completely blocks the release of acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter responsible for muscle contraction. This leads to a terrifying condition clinically referred to as floppy baby syndrome. It causes descending flaccid paralysis. The baby loses muscle tone, loses the ability to swallow, and eventually it paralyzes the diaphragm, resulting in respiratory failure that requires immediate intubation and intensive care.
That is horrifying.
It is rare, but the risk is absolute and devastating. There is no safe amount of honey for a child under 1 year old. The warning label exists because of fatal biological realities.
Okay, so biology creates risks for infants, but botany can create severe risks for adults. Let's move to analysis 2, toxic mad honey. I have heard legends about this, stories of ancient armies being poisoned or people eating honey and hallucinating. Is mad honey a real thing or just historical fiction?
Oh, it is entirely real. It is a highly documented modern toxicological phenomenon. The danger stems from the fact that bees are opportunistic foragers. They are not terribly picky about the pharmacology of the nectar they gather, they just want the sugar.
And some plants produce toxic nectar.
Yes, in certain distinct geographical regions, most notably the steep, mountainous regions bordering the Black Sea in Turkey and high-altitude areas of the Himalayas in Nepal, bees heavily forage on specific endemic species of rhododendron flowers. The nectar of these specific rhododendrons is heavily laced with complex neurotoxins called grainotoxins.
If the nectar is full of neurotoxins, why doesn't it kill the bees?
Fascinatingly, the grainotoxins are completely harmless to the bee's specific physiology. The bees gather the toxic nectar, bring it back to the hive, evaporate the water, and inadvertently concentrate the neurotoxins into the honey.
But it's not harmless to human physiology. What happens if I eat a piece of toast covered in concentrated rhododendron honey?
The grainotoxins enter your bloodstream and aggressively interfere with the voltage-gated sodium channels in your cell membranes, specifically targeting the central nervous system and cardiac tissue. They essentially jam the sodium channels open, causing a continuous state of depolarization. Consuming this mad honey triggers a severe medical condition known as mad honey disease or grainotoxin poisoning.
What are the actual symptoms? You mentioned hallucinations earlier.
Hallucinations can occur in extreme doses, but the primary symptoms are cardiovascular and neurological. Within minutes to hours of consumption, patients experience profound dizziness, extreme sweating, severe nausea, and a dangerous precipitous drop in blood pressure known as hypertension.
That sounds intense.
It gets worse. The interference with the cardiac tissue causes severe arrhythmias. Your heart rate plummets to dangerous levels. In severe cases, it leads to cardiovascular shock, loss of consciousness, and requires emergency medical intervention with atropine just to stabilize the heart.
So relying on its perfectly natural defense can literally put you in the cardiac intensive care unit.
Exactly. Location and botanical origin dictate safety, which transitions us perfectly to our final and perhaps most pervasive modern risk. Analysis 3, environmental contaminants.
This moves us away from natural plant toxins and looks at what humanity has done to the environment.
Correct. We have to understand the sheer scale of a bee colony's operation. A single hive will routinely dispatch foragers over an area of up to 7 square kilometers.
7 square kilometers, that's huge.
It is massive. You essentially have tens of thousands of microscopic environmental drones flying out every single day, sampling the water, the dust, the pollen, and the nectar in a massive radius, and bringing it all back to one central, concentrated location.
So if there is pollution in that 7 square kilometer radius, it's going to end up in the hive. Honey is basically a map of the local pollution.
Scientists literally refer to honey as a highly sensitive bioindicator. It is a perfect environmental sponge. And this has severe implications for food safety. For instance, a detailed, highly alarming study conducted in the Kellam-Malaga zone of Ethiopia analyzed dozens of local honey samples. They found extremely dangerous levels of heavy metals, specifically lead and cadmium, that significantly exceeded the maximum safety limits established by the World Health Organization.
How are massive amounts of lead and cadmium getting into the nectar of a flower?
It's not just the nectar, it's the dust. The contamination stems from the dust generated by local, unregulated mining operations, the exhaust particulate from heavy industrial traffic, and the aggressive use of cadmium-laden chemical fertilizers in nearby commercial agriculture.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that heavy metal dust settles onto the petals of the flowers. The bees land on the flowers, collect the nectar, get covered in the contaminated dust, and bring it all back to the hive. As the water evaporates, the heavy metals bioaccumulate in the honey.
And then humans ingest it. What is the danger of those specific metals?
Lead and cadmium do not break down in the human body. They bioaccumulate in your tissues and bones over decades. Chronic exposure leads to severe, irreversible neurological damage, cognitive impairment, and catastrophic kidney failure.
Wait, let's go back to the crucial filtering we talked about in Myth 5. If I am worried about lead dust from Ethiopian mining operations or grainotoxins from Turkish rhododendrons, does the ultrafiltration or the high heat pasteurization process remove these toxins? If I buy perfectly clear, filtered honey at the supermarket, am I completely safe from heavy metals?
No, that is a critical life-saving point to understand. No amount of standard industrial processing, Neither high-heat pasteurization nor ultramicrofiltration will remove heavy metals or granotoxins from honey. These toxins are chemically bound into the actual substance and molecular structure of the honey.
So if you can't filter it out, how do you ensure the honey is actually safe?
The absolute only safety measure is strict, rigorous environmental monitoring. It requires testing the honey at the source and ensuring that commercial apiaries are geographically isolated, placed far away from industrial zones, heavily sprayed agricultural monocultures, and mining operations.
So the phrase 100% natural really just means the honey is a perfect, unfiltered reflection of the environment it was created in, for better or for worse. If the environment is toxic, the natural honey is toxic.
That is the most accurate way to conceptualize it.
Wow. We have covered an immense, staggering amount of scientific ground today. Let's do a quick recap of the journey we just took. We have hopefully saved you, the listener, from the tragic mistake of aggressively microwaving your crystallized honey, protecting those incredibly delicate enzymes. We've stopped you from destroying your expensive raw honey's health benefits in a mug of hot tea. We've debunked the stubborn myth of the local allergy cure, explaining why wind-blown ragweed is your true enemy, not the bee's pollen.
A lot of myths busted today.
Absolutely. We highlighted Manuka honey's incredible heat-resistant MGO superpower, defeating MRSA by literally dehydrating the bacteria to death. And we navigated the incredibly complex, highly nuanced reality of honey's metabolic effects for diabetics, alongside the stark, non-negotiable safety warnings regarding infant botulism, natural neurotoxins, and heavy metal bioaccumulation.
We have taken the simple, unassuming plastic bear in your pantry and revealed the volatile, incredibly complex biochemistry hidden inside. But before we conclude, I want to leave you with a fascinating look at the future of this ancient food. We spent significant time discussing honey fraud, the $40 million honey laundering syndicates that ultra-filter pollen to hide the origin of cheap synthetic syrups.
Right. And if the criminals were filtering out the microscopic pollen fingerprints, how do the customs agencies and scientists actually stop them?
That is the cutting edge of modern food science. Because the fraud is so incredibly lucrative and sophisticated, scientists can no longer rely merely on microscopes and palynology. They are utilizing advanced space-age technology to catch the launderers. For example, regulatory labs are now using stable carbon isotope analysis.
Stable carbon isotope analysis. That sounds like something used to date dinosaur bones. What does it do to honey?
It looks at the fundamental atomic structure of the carbon atoms suspended in the sugar. You see, plants that produce high-quality nectar, like clover or acacia trees, utilize a specific photosynthetic pathway called the C3 pathway. But plants like corn or sugarcane, which are the exact crops used to manufacture the cheap, high-fructose syrups used to dilute and fake honey, utilize a completely different photosynthetic pathway called the C4 pathway.
And those different pathways leave a different atomic signature.
Exactly. Stable carbon isotope analysis can instantly detect the distinct atomic mass signature of C4 carbon hiding inside a batch of honey, exposing the presence of corn syrup even if the liquid has been ultrafiltered to be perfectly clear and the pollen has been obliterated.
That is sci-fi level food inspection, catching criminals by weighing the carbon atoms in their fake syrup.
Oh, it gets even more advanced. Laboratories are now utilizing DNA barcoding. Even if every single intact pollen grain has been filtered out, trace amounts of genetic material from the flowers remain suspended in the microscopic cellular debris. Scientists can amplify this DNA and trace the exact genetic lineage of the nectar, completely bypassing the need for physical pollen grains.
So even if the fingerprints are wiped, the DNA remains.
Precisely. And the absolute most advanced state-of-the-art labs are now deploying artificial intelligence driven by NMR spectroscopy, nuclear magnetic resonance. They place a sample of honey into a massive magnetic machine, which excites the nuclei of the atoms, and an artificial intelligence immediately analyzes the entire complex magnetic resonance spectrum of the chemicals.
Wow.
Within minutes, the AI can verify the exact geographical, botanical, and chemical signature of the honey, comparing its unique resonance against a massive global database of thousands of authentic honeys.
That is absolutely incredible to think about. Imagine that timeline. A completely natural biological process, perfected by bees over 5,500 years ago, flying from flower to flower, gathering nectar drop by drop, and now it is being rigorously verified by artificial intelligence, DNA amplification, and atomic isotope analysis, just to ensure that the single drop of sweetness on your tongue is the real deal.
It really is the ultimate intersection of ancient evolutionary biology and modern technological supremacy.
Well, I know I'm going to look at my pantry completely differently tomorrow morning. I'll be actively hunting for the dark, antioxidant-rich honey. I'll be keeping it far, far away from my microwave and my hot tea, and I will definitely be appreciating the incredible volatile complexity in every single spoonful. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the sticky, complex, and brilliant world of honey. Until next time.